Ave, the Emperor Augustus have given me the honorable task of counting the years passing by. And I'm going to start with I. And next year will be I. And then I. And I think after that we will make it IV. And we have V and VI, which is a really good editor. And yeah, as a good developer of counting systems, I also predict that my emperor want to count the number of hours in a day. So I developed this application that can count I, 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 I. Oh no, it should be IV. I have to rebuild. The Emperor is going to be mad if he sees this prototype. I have to fix it. Talk to you later.
No. We're not going to look at the Roman number system. We are going to look at the DateTime and the time and TimeSpan variable types. So let's start by looking at the code. And as usual, we try to max out the variable as much as we can. And then we go down and max out the time span and see what that has to offer. And we're trying to do some setting of the time and the increment here. And then we loop through and see whatever we find out when we loop through and increment the time span. And then we play around a little bit with the milliseconds and see how long time does it take to count to 10 million. And after we counted to 10 million, we are going to check how many milliseconds we got using the DateGate milliseconds, DateGet milliseconds, and also check it using the span total milliseconds. And see what the difference is between these two. Can we get 1 day in milliseconds? So we're trying to calculate 1 day in milliseconds, and we try to get that using the DateGet millisecond. But it turns out we'll have to do it like this to get that. But actually, as we saw above, the span total milliseconds will give the value for us because it brings back a total. And what have we here? We can play around with get month, get year. And then we're going to play around with some null values to see how the DateTime handles that. And the DateTime variable type is actually created to work well with the dates and time types of SQL. So then we need to handle this null value as well. So we're going to try some things here as well. And yeah, we're going to see if we can reset it to null and stuff like that, see what happens. Then we're going to change the DateTime format and see if that has any effect on this DateTime variable. We're going to play around with the string function, see if we can get the year and month from a DateTime variable. Not that we need it because we got the DateTime functions, but here you see the DateTime functions that we have. There is a lot more in the help, so go in there and check it out. But these are the main ones I wanted to play with. And we have the isValid that we also tried in the last video with the date. Calculating diffs is a really important thing when you work with dates because you want to see the difference from one date to another or from one timestamp to another. And there you have this special variable type called TimeSpan that you can use, because it's kind of a difference between two dates is a time span. And you can use that to add or subtract from a date time to get another value. You cannot do that with the time, as we're going to see later on. And so let's check that out. And then we come into the time variable type, and we create a time using the date set hour, minute, and second. And then we try to create it using a regular string and see if those two works. We do does the time work the same way as date time with time span? So we do a few tests here, playing around, quite a few of them, to see how we can work with time if we want to check the difference between different times or increment or what have you. And then to end this up, we're just going to see if we can actually get the minute out of a regular time variable. And then finally, I've added a few elements down here to check what happens in the interface when you change the date and format, to see what's actually going on there, if it has any effect on this variable type. So let's run the code. Here you can see we're maxing out the date time, and it goes up to 76, and then it becomes a -78, which matches up with the documentation fairly nice. And that's quite a range to work with. So if you saw the date video, you noticed that negative years wasn't allowed, and here you can play with a lot of negative years as well. So if you're gonna get a database with years far back in time, you probably want to use the date time. And that's also a reason why you see date time used in places where you normally would think that a date would be used. That's just because of these issues with working with the database and the range of dates available to play with. So that's why the date time is often used as a proxy for the date. And then we try to max out the time span, and time span is always a positive value, up to 65,535 days. Here we did the hours just to see, and it just adds up and turns the next hour into day one. So that's really nice. Then we have milliseconds and counting. And if you use the get milliseconds, we got 158 milliseconds, but the real answer is 1,158 milliseconds. So why is that? Well, if we use the date get milliseconds, we only get the first value, the millisecond value. But if we want to recount this entire element into milliseconds, there is no get total milliseconds, but there is a span total milliseconds that we can use instead to get this. And it matches when we use the different get datetime functions and to summarize the value. So that's good to see. And then we can see, can we get the total month of year from a time span through a date get function? Well, and get months from 90 days returns 0. It doesn't work. Get year from 582 days. No, we won't get that either. And it kind of makes sense. So it's, you can have a leap year or something, and you have months with different number of days. So it's not exact. So you cannot say it's not usable. But if you use the date get days, 25, you get 25, so that works. But what about the date get day of year? It returns 0 as well, so it doesn't try to calculate the day of year. Not sure why this makes sense at all to test, but I had to do it. Null values usually come from the database, and if we initialize a new date time, it is initialized as null. But when we set null date time, we actually get it back to a null value. So you can reset the date time to a null if you want to store it in the database as well. So that's nice. Then changing the date format is not affecting the format of the value in the code. And we're going to look at that later, how it affects the value in the interface if we can do something there. But right here, we can see we have the same format regardless of how we set it up. And that's good to know that the format is always the same when you write the code. That is not the case when you use the date variable type, as we discussed earlier. And that means that you can use this string function as well to easily grab the part of the date that you want. And in this case, we get the 00 because it's the 2 last digits from the right. But we can also use these date functions, and these are created for the DateTime variable. So they work perfectly well. And I'm not going to go into them too deep here, but you can see that it returns different values depending on which one you're using. And then we have this is date valid that takes on a date, and that says that it's true. And then we change this to use 99 instead for the day value, and that's obviously not a valid date. So this time it returns a 0. But this time, let's see. Yeah, we have to use the date set day function to get that 99 in there in the variable. Then we have trying to calculate the difference as a time span. What we're doing is that we're first calculating one minus the other, and then the other minus the first one, and we always get a positive value. It always returns the positive values. It doesn't matter which one comes first in this calculation. But the minus calculation between two date times is a time span. Then we look at time and see if we can use that in the same manner as the date time. Because I remember when I started coding DataFlex, I was in a DOS version, and when time was stored in the database there or read into the code, it was actually 5 characters. So it was a string of 5 characters, 2 for the hour, 1 for the colon, and 2 for the minute. And back then we didn't have the time variable type, I think. So let's see what it can do. We're going to try to add a time to a time span and see if that works. So we add 1 hour and 50 minutes to this 1530, but it doesn't make any difference. If we try to add an integer of 15, it doesn't change anywhere. If we try to add 2 different timestamps to each other, it's just returning the last one. And then we turn the time into a timestamp, but you can see that it won't assign, it just keeps the same value. And the same when you try to go back from one timestamp to a time, it doesn't affect the value in the assigned variable. So it just returns the same as before. So what you have to do if you want to calculate differences in time is that you have to change the time value into a datetime variable, and then you can operate with the time span on the datetime, and then convert the datetime back to a time, because then you also have control over if it overflows and become several days, because the datetime and time span variable will keep track of that. So then you can actually calculate it. But you can also get out the minute part and hour part and seconds part if you want to do the mathematics and calculations yourself. But yeah, that's up to you. So let's see what happens now if we have military as the default for this, and I click here. I'm going to add a date string. I can click the military and it'll add the date string again. If I try to add a different format, you can see that it picks up 31, but it doesn't get the rest, and it puts it in the year, and then it says, well, this seems invalid. In this one, it picks up the 12, and then it can't read the rest, so it doesn't really work. We can try to change the datetime format and see if we click here, but then we get this error saying, please enter valid date. If I switch back here, then I can again set the valid date that works with the system I'm on. So that was what I had to share about the DateTime, time, and time span variable types. I hope that was insightful, and if you have any questions, if you have any comments, or something you want me to add to this view, write it in the comments below. And I see you next time. Bye for now.